You wake to the sound of marble cracking under extreme heat. The acrid smoke fills your nostrils as you stumble from your bedchamber, your silk robes catching on the golden fixtures that once symbolized your family's divine status. Through the haze, you see her silhouette against the flames, your sister, your wife, your victim, and your destroyer. Julia Drusilla stands motionless as Rome burns around her, her face reflecting not the terror you'd expect, but something far more disturbing: relief. After 3 years of being forced to play goddess to your god, empress to your emperor, wife to the one who failed her as a brother, she watches your shared palace crumble with the serenity of someone who has already been destroyed from within. The year is 38 AD, and you are Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. History will remember you as Caligula, the mad emperor who married his own sister. But in this moment, as the flames consume everything you've built on the foundation of her suffering, you finally understand that madness was never your affliction alone. It was the inevitable result of power so absolute it could twist love into possession, protection into control, and the sacred bonds of family into chains of gold and shame. You reach for her through the smoke, but she steps back, closer to the flames. And in her eyes, you see the reflection of every unspeakable thing you've done in the name of keeping her forever yours. To understand how a brother's love transformed into history's most notorious case of imperial incest, you must first understand the world that created you both. You were born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family where blood purity wasn't just valued, but worshipped as the foundation of divine right. Your great-great-grandfather Augustus had established the precedent, marrying within the family to keep power concentrated. But what began as political calculation would mutate across generations into something far more sinister. Your childhood was a study in dysfunction dressed in purple silk. Your father Germanicus was the Golden Prince of Rome, beloved by the people and feared by the Emperor Tiberius, who saw him as a threat. When you were just 7 years old, your father died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. Poison, most whispered, though none dared say it too loudly. Your mother, Agrippina the Elder, never recovered from the loss. She became consumed with bitter paranoia that would ultimately destroy her and mark all her children with the stamp of tragedy. You had 8 siblings, but it was Drusilla who captured your heart from the earliest age. Born just 1 year after you, she possessed a beauty that seemed to glow from within, enhanced by an intelligence that matched your own. While your other sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger, were pretty enough, Drusilla was something else entirely. She had your father's noble features softened into feminine perfection, your mother's fierce spirit tempered with a gentleness that made everyone who met her fall under her spell. In those early years on the island of Capri, where Tiberius had retreated with his court, you and Drusilla were inseparable. The palace on Capri was a place of dark wonders and darker secrets, where the aging emperor indulged in pleasures that would make even hardened Romans blanch. You were just children, but you witnessed things that stripped away innocence like acid dissolving marble. You saw how power could make monsters of men, how desire unchecked by conscience could transform the most civilized facades into beasts. You protected Drusilla as best you could, creating a world within a world where you both could pretend the horrors around you didn't exist. You told her stories of when father would return, though you both knew he never would. You held her when she woke screaming from nightmares about the things she'd seen in Tiberius's pleasure gardens. You swore sacred oaths that you would always keep her safe, that no one would ever hurt her the way you'd seen other young girls hurt in those marble halls. But protection and possession are separated by the thinnest of lines, and somewhere in those years of shared trauma, your brotherly love began to twist into something else. You started to notice the way her hair caught the Mediterranean sunlight, the curve of her neck when she bent over her studies, the musical quality of her laugh that seemed to exist just for you. When courtiers began to notice her blooming beauty and make subtle inquiries about future marriage arrangements, you felt rage that burned hotter than reason could contain. The change in your relationship didn't happen overnight. It was a slow poison that seeped into your interactions, coloring every moment with a tension that neither of you fully understood at first. You became jealous when she spoke to other young men at court, even in the most innocent contexts. You found excuses to touch her, adjusting her stola, brushing imaginary dust from her cheek, letting your fingers linger longer than brotherly affection would warrant. She began to notice, but said nothing, perhaps hoping that acknowledging the change would make it real in ways that silence could still prevent. Your mother Agrippina watched this developing dynamic with growing alarm. She had survived too much to not recognize the signs of impending disaster. She tried to separate you, arranging for Drusilla to spend time with your other sisters, encouraging your interest in appropriate matches. But her interference only drove you closer together, united now against what you saw as an attempt to tear apart the only pure thing in your corrupted world. When you were 17 and Drusilla 16, your mother made her fatal mistake. She arranged Drusilla's marriage to Lucius Cassius Longinus, a respectable senator who could offer her protection and status. The betrayal, as you saw it, sent you into a rage that palace servants would later describe as inhuman. You destroyed your chambers, threatened suicide, and fell into a fever that lasted weeks. But it was Drusilla's reaction that truly revealed how deeply the poison had spread. She wept for days, refused food, and begged your mother to reconsider. Not because she feared marriage, but because she feared leaving you. The marriage proceeded despite your protests, but it was a sham from the start. Drusilla went through the motions of being a senator's wife, but everyone could see her heart remained in the palace with you. You visited constantly, finding any excuse to be near her. Longinus, either through wisdom or cowardice, never objected to these visits that stretched late into the night, to the way you looked at his wife, to the fact that she still wore the jewelry you gave her rather than his. Your salvation and Drusilla's doom came in the form of Tiberius's death in 37 A.D. The old emperor died, choking on his own depravity, some said, though others whispered that you had helped him along with a pillow over his face. Either way, you found yourself suddenly the most powerful man in the world at just 24 years old. The Senate confirmed your position, the people celebrated in the streets, and your first act as emperor was to summon Drusilla back to the palace. The pretext was that you needed family near you as you navigated the challenges of rule. You appointed her to positions of honor, had her sit beside you at official functions, included her in state decisions in ways that broke all precedent. But Rome had seen devoted brothers before, and at first your closeness was viewed as touching rather than troubling. The people loved the idea of the beautiful young emperor and his equally beautiful sister working together to restore Rome's glory after Tiberius's dark final years. But those within the palace knew better. They saw how you dismissed Drusilla's husband from court, encouraging him to accept a convenient posting in a distant province. They noticed how you insisted she move into chambers adjoining yours, how you entered without announcement at all hours, how servants were dismissed when you were together. They observed the way you looked at her during state dinners, a hunger in your eyes that had nothing to do with brotherly affection. The first public sign of impropriety came during the festival of Minerva. You insisted that Drusilla sit in the seat reserved for the empress, though you were unmarried. When questioned, you declared that she was more than empress. She was your divine partner, descended like you from Augustus's blood. The religious authorities exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. You were emperor. Your word was law, even when that word violated laws both human and divine. Behind closed doors, the situation deteriorated rapidly. You began requiring Drusilla's presence for every meal, every meeting, every moment of leisure. You dressed her in the finest silks from the furthest reaches of the empire, covered her in jewels that would have funded legions, built her private baths of porphyry and gold. But these gifts came with chains invisible to the eye but heavy on the soul. She could go nowhere without your permission, see no one without your approval, breathe no breath that you didn't authorize. The servants whispered of your presence in her chambers at strange hours, and rumors of blurred boundaries spread. They told of Drusilla's tears, of her prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned her, of the way her hands shook when she poured your wine at dinner. But they also spoke of something else, something perhaps even more disturbing than simple coercion. They spoke of moments when she looked at you as something that might have been love, twisted into a shape that nature never intended. Stockholm Syndrome wasn't a term that existed in ancient Rome, but the condition itself is as old as power and captivity. Isolated from everyone but you, dependent on you for everything, subjected to your absolute will while being told it was devotion, Drusilla's mind began to fracture under the strain. She started to echo your justifications, speaking of divine blood and destiny, of how the gods themselves married siblings, of how your love transcended mortal law. You formalized your obscene union in a ceremony that mocked everything marriage was meant to represent. Though Longinus still lived in his distant province, you declared the marriage dissolved by imperial decree. You dressed Drusilla in the wedding garments of a virgin bride. Though innocence had long since been stripped from both of you, you spoke vows that promised eternal unity, using words that made even hardened politicians blanch. You placed a symbolic ring on her finger, declaring your eternal bond. The wedding feast was a study in Roman hypocrisy at its finest. Senators who privately expressed horror at your actions publicly offered congratulations and expensive gifts. Their wives, who whispered prayers for Drusilla when they thought no one was listening, smiled and complimented her beauty. Everyone played their parts in the grotesque theater you had created, knowing that to break character meant death or exile. But even absolute power couldn't completely silence the disgust your actions provoked. Graffiti appeared on walls comparing you to the monsters of myth who devoured their own families. Philosophers spoke in careful metaphors about the natural order and the consequences of its violation. Foreign ambassadors sent coded messages back to their kingdoms describing the moral rot at the heart of the empire. The Jewish population, with their strict laws against such unions, viewed your reign as a proof of pagan depravity. You responded to criticism with increasing paranoia and violence. Men who questioned your relationship with Drusilla found themselves accused of treason. Women who showed sympathy for your sister discovered their own families under investigation. You created an atmosphere where your unnatural union had to be not just tolerated, but celebrated, where failure to show sufficient enthusiasm for the imperial marriage was itself a crime. In this climate of fear and forced acceptance, Drusilla became something more than just your victim. You elevated her to unprecedented heights of power, granting her privileges no woman had held in Roman history. She was given the right to sit with the Vestal virgins at public games, though virginity was a ship that had long since sailed. She received the title of Augusta while you still lived, an honor typically reserved for deceased and deified women. Coins bore her image alongside yours, presenting you to the empire as divine twins ruling as one. But power without freedom is just another form of bondage, and Drusilla wielded her authority with the desperation of someone trying to find meaning in meaninglessness. She threw herself into charitable works, founding orphanages and funding grain distributions, as if good deeds could wash clean the stain of what occurred each night in the imperial bedchamber. She became obsessed with religious rituals, spending hours in temple purifications that never seemed to make her feel pure. Your own descent into what historians would later call madness accelerated with each passing month. The line between God and emperor, already blurred in Roman tradition, disappeared entirely in your mind. You declared yourself and Drusilla living deities, demanding sacrifices and worship. You appeared in public dressed as various gods, Jupiter, Apollo, even Venus, and insisted Drusilla accompany you as your divine consort. The sight of the emperor dressed as the goddess of love while fondling his sister before the Senate became one of those images that burned itself into Roman collective memory. But even gods can sicken, and in September of 38 AD, Drusilla fell ill with a fever that resisted all treatment. You summoned the greatest physicians from across the empire, threatening to crucify them if they failed to cure her. You sacrificed hundreds of animals to every deity known to Rome, promising temples and monuments if they would spare her. You even offered your own life in exchange for hers, standing on the steps of the temple of Jupiter and shouting your bargain to the heavens. As Drusilla lay dying, she spoke words that palace scribes were ordered never to record, but which survived in whispered memory. She thanked you for loving her and cursed you for the form that love had taken. She forgave you for destroying her and begged forgiveness for allowing herself to be destroyed. She spoke of the children that never lived, lost to a legacy too fragile to endure. When she finally died, your grief was spectacular in its excess. You ordered a complete cessation of all public business, forbidding laughter, bathing, or family dinners throughout the empire. You had her body preserved with exotic spices and displayed in the palace for weeks, speaking to it as if she could still hear. You remained beside her preserved body, speaking as if she could still hear you. The funeral itself was an exercise in grandiose delusion. You had Drusilla's body burned on a pyre of precious woods and rare incenses that could be smelled throughout Rome. You declared her a goddess, establishing a cult in her honor with priests, temples, and mandatory worship. You had statues of her erected in every major city, showing her in divine aspect. But the sculptors, try as they might, could never quite capture the sadness that had lived behind her eyes in those final years. Your behavior after her death made your previous excesses seem restrained by comparison. You wandered the palace, calling her name, ordered servants to set her place at every meal, conducted state business with her empty chair beside you. You took to appearing in public dressed in mourning clothes of your own design, bizarre combinations of different cultural traditions that created a visual representation of grief unmoored from sanity. You married again, multiple times, but each wife became a cruel parody of what you had lost. You required your wives to resemble Drusilla in dress and demeanor. When they inevitably failed to be her, you discarded them through divorce, exile, or execution. You took to calling random women Drusilla in the street, sometimes bringing them to court in desperate attempts to recapture what had been lost. The empire watched in terrified fascination as you unraveled. You declared war on Neptune, ordering soldiers to stab the sea and collect seashells as spoils of victory. You built a bridge across the Bay of Naples just to ride across it in triumph. You opened a brothel in the palace staffed by senators' wives. Each act of insanity could be traced back to that central wound, the loss of the sister you had destroyed in the name of possessing. Your remaining sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger, watched your deterioration with calculating eyes. They had learned from Drusilla's fate that your love was more dangerous than your hate. When you began showing signs of transferring your obsession to them, they took action. They conspired with lovers and allies, planning your assassination with the cold efficiency of survivors who understood that it was you or them. But even as plots swirled around you, you remained fixated on Drusilla's memory. You claimed to speak with her ghost, issuing edicts you said came from her divine wisdom. You had mediums and mystics brought from the far corners of the empire, promising vast rewards to anyone who could truly bring her back. One charlatan after another took your gold and performed their rituals, each failing to produce more than shadows and lies. The end came as it had to, with blood and betrayal. As you walked through the palace Cryptoporticus on a January morning in 41 AD, members of your own Praetorian Guard fell upon you with swords. As the blades pierced your body, witnesses claimed you called out Drusilla's name, reaching toward a figure only you could see. Whether this was truth or embellishment, it became part of the legend. The mad emperor dying as he had lived, grasping for a love that had destroyed everything it touched. Your death brought no peace to Drusilla's memory. The Senate tried to erase you both from history, destroying statues and scratching names from monuments. But some stories are too dark to forget, and the tale of the emperor who married his sister passed into legend. Moralists used it as a warning about the corruption of absolute power. Poets found in it a grotesque romance that fascinated even as it repelled. Historians debated how much was truth and how much was propaganda spread by your enemies. But for those who had lived through it, who had seen the reality behind the legend, the truth was simpler and more terrible. You had taken the purest form of human love, the bond between siblings who had survived trauma together, and perverted it into something monstrous. You had used your power to transform protector into predator, sister into victim, love into a weapon that destroyed everything it claimed to cherish. Modern psychology would recognize in your story elements of trauma bonding, coercive control, and the corruption of power dynamics within families. But the Romans needed no such terms to understand what they had witnessed. They saw a man who had become a god in his own mind and had demanded his sister worship him in ways that violated every boundary nature and society had established. They saw a woman trapped between love and revulsion, power and powerlessness, compliance and resistance, until madness seemed the only sane response. The palace where your crimes took place was eventually torn down and rebuilt, but some stains sink too deep into stone to ever be cleansed. Subsequent emperors avoided the private chambers you had shared with Drusilla, claiming they were haunted by sounds of weeping that no amount of incense could mask. Servants reported seeing figures in the corridors, a young woman fleeing from a shadow that pursued her through eternity, forever running from a love that had become her doom. Archaeological excavations centuries later would uncover hidden chambers in the palace complex, rooms that had been sealed and forgotten. Among the artifacts found were personal items that historians believe belonged to Drusilla, jewelry boxes filled with pearls that had turned black with age, mirrors cracked in patterns that suggested deliberate destruction, and most haunting of all, a collection of small carved figures that appeared to be infant funeral monuments, their inscriptions carefully obliterated. These physical remnants hint at stories even darker than those preserved in written records. They suggest midnight rituals to dispose of evidence of incestuous unions, desperate attempts to hide the physical consequences of unnatural love. They speak of a woman trying to maintain some shred of identity and dignity in circumstances that stripped both away daily. They whisper of grief for losses that could never be publicly acknowledged, for children who existed only as shameful secrets buried in palace walls. The legacy of your relationship with Drusilla extended far beyond your deaths. Future emperors would use your excess as justification for their own cruelties, arguing that at least they hadn't married their sisters. The fear of concentrated bloodlines that your union represented contributed to changes in Roman marriage law and inheritance practices. Most significantly, your story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power combined with disordered love, a reminder that the capacity for both great love and great evil can exist in the same heart. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is how your monstrous actions obscured the real woman Drusilla had been before you transformed her into an object of your obsession. Historical sources, focused on the scandal of your relationship, tell us little about her thoughts, her dreams, her desires beyond survival. She exists in history primarily as your victim, defined entirely by what was done to her rather than who she was. This erasure of her personhood continues the violation you began, reducing a complex human being to a supporting role in your tragedy. If we could strip away the layers of myth and horror, we might find a young woman of remarkable intelligence and strength, someone who survived years of unimaginable abuse while maintaining enough humanity to inspire genuine mourning among those who knew her. We might discover a person who used what little power she had to help others, who faced each day with courage that most of us will never need to summon. We might see not just a victim, but a survivor who endured the unendurable until her body could no longer contain a spirit too wounded to heal. The morning light that finds its way into the ruins of the palace complex today illuminates stones that have forgotten the specific sorrows they once witnessed. Tourists walk where you once forced Drusilla to play goddess, taking photographs where blood and tears once stained marble floors. The guidebooks mention you both as historical curiosities, reducing lives of unbearable intensity to paragraph-long summaries suitable for casual consumption. But in the shadows that even noon cannot dispel, in the corners where ancient grief has worn grooves in stone, something remains. Call it memory, call it haunting, call it the weight of witnessed suffering that cannot be entirely erased. It reminds us that power without conscience creates monsters, that love without boundaries becomes destruction, and that the victims of history's great crimes deserve more than footnotes in their abusers' stories. You died, calling Drusilla's name, reaching for a salvation that your crimes had made impossible. She died months before, finally free from a love that had been her lifelong prison. Between those two deaths lies a truth too terrible for comfortable contemplation, that the greatest horrors are often committed by those who claim to love us most, that protection can become predation with terrifying ease, and that absolute power corrupts not just politically but in the most intimate spaces of human connection. The emperor who married his sister has become a symbol of Roman decadence, a shorthand for the empire's moral collapse. But symbols simplify what should remain complex, reduce human suffering to historical lessons. The reality was a young woman, trapped in circumstances no one should endure, destroyed by a brother whose love became indistinguishable from hate, whose protection became the very thing from which she needed protecting. In the end, history remembers a bond corrupted by unchecked power, a tragedy born not only of love distorted, but of silence allowed to fester. Let it be remembered not to shock, but to warn.